Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Monday, March 17th, day 528 of the war. Amanda Borshel-Dan here with our military reporter, Emmanuel Fabian. Hi, Manny. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Amanda.
Hi. All eyes are again on Yemen's Iran-backed Houthi rebels who have this morning claimed responsibility for a second attack on an American aircraft carrier, the second in 24 hours. They're calling it a retaliation for U.S. strikes. So we'll hear how Israel is readying for a possible escalation. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced yesterday his intention to dismiss Shin Bet chief Ronen Bar, bringing to a head months of growing disagreements between the two men. So Manny will weigh in on the security side of the disagreement and who may be Bar's replacement. We'll also learn what is happening on the ground in the Gaza Strip as airstrikes continue, and we'll check in on Israel's other borders. All this and more when we're back. Yemen's Iran-backed Houthi rebels claimed this morning, that they have twice attacked an American airship carrier group within 24 hours. Now, the Houthis initially said they launched 18 missiles and a drone at the aircraft carrier USS Harry Truman and its accompanying warships in the Red Sea, before hours later claiming to have fired a second round. So, Manny, things are heating up here with the Houthis, but I understand that already last week, Israel's Air Force raised its preparedness to high alert. So what do you know about what's happening here, Manny?
So when the Houthis announced about a week ago their intention to potentially resume drone and missile attacks on Israel like they had been doing during the war up until the ceasefire, so the Israeli Air Force raised its level alert. Completely independently of the US plans to then launch a major bombing campaign against the Houthis. From what I understand, Israel was also updated in advance on the Americans' plans, but Israel was raising its alert anyway because the Houthis were going, or at least threatening to resume their attacks on Israel. Right now, we haven't seen any direct attacks on Israel yet by the Houthis, since the ceasefire. There was a missile, one of these missiles that the Houthis claim to have launched at the American strike carrier group. One of them hit, as far as we understand, hit in Egypt near Sharm el-Sheikh. The Israeli Air Force was looking into potentially, whether or not this was actually aimed at Israel or not. But from what we understand now from the Houthis' claims, that it was not aimed at Israel, but rather at the American warships in the Red Sea. But still, the high alert remains, even more so now that the Americans have launched this new bombing campaign. The presumption is that the Houthis will respond in one way or another and take their rage out on Israel because of the US's bombing campaign. But from what we've seen already in the past year of the war, Israel has the capability to intercept these missiles. Obviously, nothing's ever 100%, but when the Houthis launch ballistic missiles, Israel has air defense systems that can counter it. When they launch drones, Israeli Air Force jets can intercept them, hopefully far away. Sometimes they do bypass the defenses and hit Israel, but only been a few cases like that. But the alert is there. Israel's ready for that kind of thing to return.
So Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu last night summoned Shin Bet chief Ronen Bar for an urgent meeting in his office, and there informed him that the cabinet would vote for Ronen Bar's dismissal later in the week. There's some controversy over when and how this can happen, and Hebrew media is reporting that a vote on Bar's dismissal could take place in a special cabinet meeting on Wednesday. However, Attorney General Gali Baharav Miara told Netanyahu yesterday night that he could not, quote, initiate a dismissal process of Bar until the factual and legal basis underlying your decision is fully examined, as well as your authority to address the matter at this time. All of this is playing out as we're recording. But I want to talk to you, Manny, about the role of the Shin Bet chief as, of course, one of the most important in terms of Israel's security and deterrence. And so I wonder if you see this dismissal, which isn't exactly sudden, but is at the same time sudden, as affecting Israel's deterrence or security standing in the region.
I think a big shakeup is going to be within the security agency itself, which will then sort of echo outwards, and Israel's enemies may perceive the country differently. Within the security agency, this is a big deal right now. It's Ronen Bar had plans to resign at some point. He's already announced this intention. There are other people who may be appointed instead of him. There's at least two top Shin Bet officers who are considered to be potential successors. But when Netanyahu in this case announces that he's dismissing him, and the thought process is that he's going to appoint maybe someone who's not going to be maybe the best for the Shin Bet, but someone who's going to be better for Netanyahu, as we saw in Bar's statement that he made, saying that Netanyahu, if he wants to choose someone who's loyal to him rather than loyal to the state, that's something that is unacceptable. That can't happen. And I think that if this process goes through, if Bar is removed and someone else is appointed, someone who is not doesn't have their is not really there for trying to help state security, but rather someone who's going to be there just to be Netanyahu's yes man, that's going to be very problematic for the Shin Bet. It may cause people to resign from the Shin Bet. And then that, outwards could be a huge issue for Israel. Israel's enemies could look at the country and see, a dysfunctional security agency and take advantage of that kind of thing. From what we understand, there's two top Shin Bet officers who are considered at least within the Shin Bet as the potential successors. There's the current deputy of the Shin Bet, and then there's the former deputy. Up until around a few months ago, he was the deputy. The former deputy actually is on the hostage negotiation team now, after Bar was kicked off of it. So he is thought to be one of the leading candidates. There's another Shin Bet officer, a third one, who also may be considered someone who's he was held some senior positions and then left several years ago. He may return to the agency. And Netanyahu may also bring someone from outside, another defense official. We've seen in the past that people leading the Shin Bet, not necessarily served in the Shin Bet initially, leaders of other security agencies, from the army, from the police, from any other organization, or from the Mossad. And there's also the name of Meir Ben Shabbat has been brought up. He used to be a senior official in the Shin Bet, the head of the Southern District, and later headed Israel's National Security Council, known as the Malal in Hebrew. And he is also considered very close to Netanyahu. So there's a chance that he is chosen. There's a chance that one of the Shin Bet officers are. We don't really know yet. It's a bit speculative at this stage. But it seems like this is going to go through within the next few days, few weeks, perhaps, and we'll know who's replacing Ronen Bar.
Right. Obviously, several of the figures you've mentioned, we can't reveal their names, or perhaps even don't know them. They often go by an initial, such as Mem, whom you mentioned, who is in the hostage release negotiations team. But I think it should be emphasized, of course, that they report to Netanyahu. All of these leaders, the chief of staff of the army and the leader of the Shin Bet, do report to Netanyahu. So I guess the question is, of course, shouldn't he be allowed to choose a replacement with whom he thinks he could have a good working relationship?
Oh, definitely. I mean, there's no question about that. I will actually just correct you slightly. The IDF chief of staff answers to the defense minister, whereas the Shin Bet is actually under the Prime Minister's office. The Shin Bet and the Mossad are under the Prime Minister's office, which is very interesting for it being a security agency. The Defense Ministry has nothing really to do with them all that much.
Though, of course, the Defense Minister answers to the Prime Minister, correct?
Of course. I do think it's incredibly important that the Prime Minister and the chief of the Shin Bet get along. There really isn't a question about that. And I think that for sure he should choose someone that he can get along with. The issue that Ronen Bar brought up in his letter is the fact that he's being dismissed not because of the agencies and his own failures in the lead up to October 7th or afterward, but rather because of a personal issue that Netanyahu has with him. And then you get into a situation where the person he may be replacing him with is going to be someone who's a Netanyahu yes man, who's just going to do everything he says. And not someone who has the interests of Israel's state security at the top of their priority.
Though one could hope that anyone who has reached the status of being a contender can definitely stand on his own two legs and also voice an opinion when it is in contrast to that of the prime ministers.
For sure.
All right, let's go to a short break and then we'll check in on all of Israel's borders. And we're back. So the IDF on yesterday, detailed the identities of 6 Palestinian terror operatives it said were killed in airstrikes in northern Gaza's Beit Lahia on Saturday. These included a terrorist who participated in the October 7th, 2023 onslaught. Now, according to Palestinian media, the strikes on Saturday killed 9, including journalists. So what is the IDF saying about these allegations, Manny, so far?
So the IDF has detailed the identities of 6, despite media reports saying 9 were killed. I'm not sure who the additional 3 are. Sometimes the death tolls we see from Gaza aren't always accurate, so it may be that only 6 were killed. We haven't been able to completely verify this yet. Regardless, according to the IDF, so the strike, there was 2 strikes in this incident. One was targeting, according to the IDF, a group of terrorists who were using a drone in Bet Lahia to, potentially observe troops. According to the IDF, they were using this surveillance to plan attacks against Israel. And then once that strike was carried out, another group according to the IDF, another group of terrorists approached the area and collected the drone equipment and got into a car, and then the IDF struck that car as well. So the army has detailed the identities of 6 of them, including at least 2 who, according to Palestinian media, were journalists. One was working for Turkey's news agency as a drone photographer there. But the IDF said that he, specifically was a member of Hamas's Zaytun battalion, who was, quote, operating under the guise of a journalist. There was another a member of Hamas who was operating under the guise of a journalist. According to the IDF, he was another member of the terror group. There was a terrorist who was involved, who basically invaded Israel on October 7th during the attack. There was a member of Hamas's engineering forces. There was another Palestinian Islamic Jihad operative, who had actually been released in the latest ceasefire deal. And it wouldn't be the first time, of course, during the war that Israel has accused Palestinians who say they are journalists or have bylines on various media outlets or photos that are credited to them, with the army accusing them of being members of terror groups. We've even seen evidence of this as well. The army's uncovered documents and footage from computers in Gaza and shown that, this person who is working for Al Jazeera is, also a member of Islamic Jihad. There's been evidence of this. So these accusations, in this case, the army hasn't provided additional proof, but in the past it has for such cases. And really it's very problematic that Hamas or Hamas members are sort of moonlighting as other jobs during the war, during the ceasefire. They take off their uniform and go and become a journalist for a bit, and then they return to be a terrorist afterwards during the fighting. At least in previous cases, we've seen this in this case. The army has not yet provided additional evidence.
So the army hasn't provided additional evidence, but the army is quite certain of its identification process, correct?
Yeah, the army is very certain. There are, of course, those who doubt it. But normally in these cases, from what I've seen in the past, is the more sensitive intelligence that the actual evidence that proves this, Israel will give to its allies, its intelligence allies in the US or in Europe, because those countries often will ask Israel, why did you kill these journalists? So Israel will share with them the actual intelligence findings, making sure it doesn't leak outside, because it can reveal all sorts of methods that the army has. But in general, Israel is very certain about its identification process. There have been mistakes in the past. We've seen cases where Israel targeted a senior Hamas commander and then later said that it didn't actually kill him because the intelligence was wrong. So the intelligence could be wrong. Nothing's ever 100%, but Israel is quite certain in this case. But if something is proved otherwise, of course, we'll update on that.
Right. Now, what else is happening on the ground in Gaza right now? The ceasefire has officially finished, and yet the fighting has not officially restarted, even though, of course, throughout the ceasefire, there were some airstrikes, etc., to ward off attacks on IDF troops and others. So what is happening on the ground right now, Manny?
So the ceasefire is still in effect, but the hostage deal is over. So I think that's the way to put it, because we haven't seen a hostage release in 3 weeks, I think. But meanwhile, there is a ceasefire on the ground. During the ceasefire, the army, in pretty much a nearly day occurrence now, has carried out strikes on who the IDF says are Hamas or Islamic Jihad operatives trying to plant bombs in the ground near where Israeli troops are. Apparently, in preparation for when Israel resumes its fighting, then all of these booby traps will be prepared, so to speak, for when the troops advance back into Gaza. So there have been several cases like this in the past few weeks. Basically, every single day, the army has carried out strikes like this against operatives trying to plant bombs. There were reports during this time that in some cases, civilians were killed by these strikes. So the army said it identified them as planting bombs, but according to Palestinian reports, they were, innocent civilians. The army hasn't commented on the specifics of these cases yet, but there was a case, I think it was on Thursday or Friday, where a child was killed in one of these strikes. Perhaps he was nearby or next to these terrorists, or maybe they weren't terrorists at all. It's hard to say. The reports from Gaza since the beginning of the war have been a little hazy and difficult to verify, and it's difficult to verify both claims, both from what we're hearing from Gaza and sometimes even the army's claims are difficult to verify.
Right. And the assumption is, as you said, that booby traps are being set for the resumption of fighting, just as we heard recently from released hostage Tal Shoham, that while he was in captivity in the tunnels, he could hear that the Hamas operatives, terrorists, were tunneling further and further in preparation for more operations. So let's check also some of Israel's other borders. And there was an interesting case near Jordan in which Israeli soldiers shot dead 2 suspects who crossed into Israel from Jordan near the northern town of Beit Shean, which is close to the Galilee, the Sea of Galilee. That happened shortly after midnight between Thursday and Friday. So they were part of a group of some 8 suspects who were trying to cross into Israel. And Manny, do you have any idea what their intentions were?
So from what we understand from the army, they were work migrants. So they were trying to enter Israel for work. I don't know to tell you who they are. As far as I understand, they're not Jordanian. And we've seen this many times in the past. Usually Africans who are in Arab states trying to reach Israel for work. We saw in recent years, of course, of many reaching from Egypt because that's the normal path to reach from Africa to Israel, but also strange cases where African migrants are trying to reach Israel from Lebanon or from Syria and from Jordan as well. So I don't know for sure which country these work migrants are from, but that's usually the case of people trying to enter Israel for work. So the 6 were detained, 2 were shot dead. From what I heard from the army is the 2 suspects kind of jumped out of a bush and sort of spooked the soldiers, and they opened fire because they thought they were under an attack or something. The other 6 were unharmed. There was an interesting case actually several months ago where the army carried out a strike on the Lebanon border after they identified suspects approaching it. And it turned out they were actually work migrants from Turkey. So just add that as well. So it's not always from Africa. It could be from any country in the region. I'm not sure what's happened to those suspects. Usually they are, the army returns them. There was a case a couple of weeks ago of suspects who entered Israel from Jordan, and the army detained them and then sent them immediately back to Jordan through the fence. I presume that in this case as well, the army will send them back through the Jordanian border, back to the Jordanian authorities.
Let's quickly look at Egypt. And very recently, there was yet another drone that was shot down by the Karkal battalion because there's an uptick of weapons smuggling, in addition, of course, to the drug smuggling that we've become accustomed to.
Yeah, this has also become almost a daily occurrence for these drones carrying weapons. In this case, it was just one gun, but there's been cases where larger drones are carrying over a dozen assault rifles. And the troops stationed on the border, they identify them, they shoot down the drone, either using their actual guns or with other electronic warfare means, bring down the drone and seize the equipment. But it sort of begs the question as to how many other drones are they missing when they're chasing down one of these drones with one weapon on it. And these drones that are flying over, they're bringing in drugs and weapons that are normally collected by crime gangs in the south, usually from the Bedouin community. And we've also seen cases of these, very similar drug and weapon smugglings from Israel, from southern Israel into the Gaza Strip as well. And there's been strikes in Gaza in recent weeks as well against suspects on the Palestinian side collecting drones that were flown in from southern Israel. On the Israeli side, I think only one suspect has been arrested so far. The army, or I guess, and the police can't manage to track down exactly who's launching these drones into Gaza, but it's presumed to be sort of part of the same sort of crime gang where they bring in weapons and drugs from Egypt into Israel. They either sell them in Israel or they smuggle them into Gaza and have them sold there as well.
All right, and now let's look at Lebanon. And yesterday we heard about reports of gunfire coming from Lebanon that shot at an Israeli vehicle. What are you hearing about this?
So from what we understand, it wasn't a direct attack on Israel, but there was a funeral being held for a Hezbollah member in one of the villages. Not that Hezbollah is allowed to be, to have presence in these areas, but during the funeral there was gunfire, and one of these errant shots landed in Avivim, hit the windshield of a car, and caused some damage to it. In response, the defense minister, Israel Katz, ordered the IDF to carry out strikes in Lebanon in response, and the army did carry out strikes last night. It targeted a command center belonging to Hezbollah and some other buildings used by the terror group. Also kind of raises the question as to why these weren't targeted earlier if they're, in South Lebanon and in a violation of the ceasefire. But I don't know. I don't have an answer to why they're only being targeted now. But that's how we're seeing things develop in Lebanon. Is any violation that Israel identifies or claims to be a violation, Israel responds, and anytime they identify Hezbollah infrastructure or operatives, we saw some strikes against several prominent members of the terror group in the last few weeks as well. Israel will go ahead and target them. It's not sort of the reality that we're seeing now is not anything like the post-2006 war, where once there was a ceasefire, everyone disengaged and there was nothing going on between the sides. Israel is, as I've been told, aggressively enforcing the ceasefire.
Okay, our final stop on our border tour is Syria, and amid the unrest in Syria, Israeli fighter jets on Thursday struck a residential building that the military said served as a Damascus headquarters for Palestinian Islamic Jihad to plan and carry out terror activities. And as opposed to many other strikes in the past, the IDF indeed produced footage detailing the strike. What do you know, Manny?
Yes, so the army published footage of the strike. It seemed to target an apartment building. There was a report, I think it was by the Associated Press, that said that the home belonged to Islamic Jihad leader Ziad Nakhala, who was not there at the time. He's normally in Lebanon or in Iran. He kind of moves around the places, and sometimes in Syria. This strike comes as we've been told that there's a fear that following the fall of the Assad regime and the chaos in Syria, that Palestinian terror organizations, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, which have a presence in Syria, will be able to gain power and use Syria as a sort of springboard to launch attacks on Israel. And this is especially after sort of many of these Hamas and Islamic Jihad leaders and operatives were jailed by the Assad regime. and they were released from prison with the overthrow of the former regime. So now they're all free and they're able to potentially launch attacks on Israel. So there's a lot of focus by Israel now on these Palestinian terror groups. Of course, Iran and Hezbollah are also under sort of in Israel's focus, but the current Syrian government is very much against Hezbollah and Iran, so their presence in Syria is limited, but the Palestinian terror groups are, as far as Israel sees right now, are still able to move around freely. And that's where at least this strike and other strikes in the last few weeks have been basically focused on to prevent weapons from falling into their hands so that they can carry out attacks on Israel.
Okay, thank you for that whirlwind tour. I just want to finish our program. We have been going on quite a long time so far, but I want to finish the program with an incident that happened in Gaza over Purim. And the IDF has taken a platoon of reservists out of the Gaza Strip after a video posted to social media showed the troops opening fire during the reading of the Book of Esther. Anyone who is familiar with the reading of the Book of Esther knows that when the name Haman, the villain of the story, is recited, the audience tries to blot it out by making loud noises. So in this case, the IDF reservists decide to shoot their weapons. So Manny, what was their punishment? And do you think that it fit the crime?
So the army handed down punishments. The troops and the commanders of the troops were sentenced by their brigade commander. We're talking about the Gaza Division's Southern Brigade, one of the reserve battalions of the Southern Brigade. The company commander received a reprimand that will go on his record. So not a particularly serious punishment, but the platoon commander responsible for those troops will be removed from his role. He'll be dismissed from his role as a platoon commander. He'll be moved to some other role in the reserves. And then 9 reservists who were seen in the video shooting and reciting the Megillah will all be removed from combat service and also be forced to stay on base for 28 days. It's not jail time, but it's like jail time, but it's in their base. Relatively serious punishment for such an incident. I think I remember seeing last year a similar case happening where soldiers were shooting during Megillah reading. Even in previous years, we've seen this kind of thing take place in shooting ranges, although that's maybe slightly more acceptable if it's in a shooting range rather than within the sort of an operational front. That these are troops that are in the buffer zone and they're opening fire toward Gaza for not really any necessary reason. And I think that this relatively serious punishment for these troops is a result of the new IDF Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir. In his first meeting with commanders last week, he told the commanders that the importance of operational discipline. We've seen during the war in Gaza how the Israeli military's discipline has kind of fallen quite a lot. All these videos of troops doing things against protocol or even more serious things that are considered to be criminal offenses or even to more extreme war crimes. Operational discipline is something that Eyal Zamir has stated is something that is very, very important. And this is probably the first example of this, of troops doing something that is relatively harmless. They weren't shooting at anybody directly, but still it's sort of for the principle of this, and this incident was taken very seriously by the army, and it's safe to say that Zamir is probably is aware of this incident and probably spoke to the commander about this, and that's why we saw a relatively harsh punishment. I do hope that this will serve as an example for other soldiers who are operating in Gaza and other fronts to be a bit more disciplined, even if they're bored or if they're a little upset that they're not with their families on Purim, to still treat the operational front that they're in as something serious and not treat it in an unserious way, like they did in this incident.
Right. There's definitely a new sheriff in town, right, Manny?
Yep.
Manny, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.